Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I'm Rana Foroohar. I'm a columnist and global business editor at the FT. Really excited to be here again with you. I think this is my fifth or sixth time here, and I find this forum just the best for what it is, and I always come away with a ton of ideas. I'm going to just very quickly introduce the panelists, and we're going to have some Q&A amongst ourselves for about 50 minutes or so, an hour, and then we're going to open it up to the audience, and we'll finish up at 3:30. So just quickly going down, and I'll just say very quickly, you guys have bios. To my left is Randall Picker from Chicago. And to his left, Nolan McCarty from Princeton. To his left, Nicolas Petit from EUI. And at the very end, the queen of European antitrust, Cristina Caffarra.
Yeah, that's good.
I could say University College London, but you're bigger than that. So your brand is bigger than that. I'll just quickly set the stage. This panel is really going over the 2019 study that was done, report that was done by the Stigler Center on digital platforms, and sort of looking at where were we in 2019, where are we now. I'll just quickly summarize some of the key findings, which were that big tech is uniquely positioned to play the political influence game because of all the things that I'm sure everyone's been talking about: money, data, size, complexity, First Amendment protections, et cetera. They are impacting, as we well know, and I'm sure we'll dig into, the political and economic landscape in profound and unique ways. There was a call for campaign finance laws to be reformed, a need for transparency, which we were just talking about earlier. And on that note, I'm going to ask everyone before they speak to actually announce any conflicts of interest that they might have. And ultimately, the finding was that a new digital authority was necessary to really rein in these players and put them back in service, if they can be put in service, to the real economy. So we're going to be talking about what, if anything, has changed, how these topics have played out over the last few years. But in the interest of time, Cristina literally has 20 minutes, and she is going to have to run, and she has a lot to say, of importance. And so, Cristina, I mean, one of the questions I was going to start with is, are they really unique? Are they different? What have we learned? Has anything changed in the last 5 years? I put that to you, but you take it where you want to go, and then I'm going to have folks respond to you.
Thank you so much, Rana, and thank you for having me. Of course, it's a particular pleasure to be on this panel with Rana because, of course, she is the only person I trust to moderate panels at my conference in Brussels. Other than that, it is a total marathon for me, but she is the partner in crime there. And thank you, of course, Luigi and Guy for having me here. Disclosures. I have been a consultant, economic consultant, for the best part of 25 years. In that capacity, I have advised against Google, against Facebook, for Amazon, for Apple, for Microsoft, and a very long list of other companies. I stopped being a consultant 2 years ago, so at this point I can happily humble brag that I am not being paid by anyone, not even 50 cents. So I have no disclosure, no economic interest at this point. That life is pretty much behind me. It's particularly, in a way, touching to start this, to have a panel that goes back to the heady days of 2019. I think that was a magnificent edition of this conference in which we had Lena before she was Lena, we had Jonathan when he was an antitrust lawyer, and many other people in this room feeling a sense of hope and a sense of expectation that the diagnosis was there, the report was clearly very deep and well researched. We had a diagnosis and we had hope that we would be able to do something concrete about it. And indeed, in Europe, there was a sense we just kind of issued the Android decision, the European Commission in 2018, and that came a few months after really the search decision. So there was a sense that, things were kind of bedding down in Europe, but Europe was ahead, Europe was moving, and it was at this conference in 2019 that I was effectively recruited by Doug Peterson, the Attorney General for Nebraska, who was leading, certainly not a forgotten name, the multi-state effort against Google, which really started enforcement in this country against Google. So this was pretty much a heady time. Now we're here 6 years later, and it's strange to me that when I come now to this conference last year, I had to listen to a panel in which mostly American academics talk fondly about how well the DMA is doing. And on this edition, we heard yesterday a panel in which there is a great deal of expectation and still trepidation about, the DSA is actually doing things. Give it time. It's only a year old, but it will do things. I would like to inject a dose of realism and reality check into these assessments. Are we winning? Absolutely, emphatically not in any dimension in Europe. We are not winning. And we're not winning on the grounds that the early antitrust effort failed. We were at the time kind of looking at the end of the Android cases. Then we had more against Google. We had 2 cases against Amazon, 2 cases against Apple, 2 cases against Microsoft. Nothing is remotely moved on the ground. Not a single bit. Not a single bit in 6 years. There has been no change. Then in Europe, we funneled completely our effort and attention into the notion that regulation was going to save us. So indeed, the DMA and the DSA. And this is no slight on the incredible effort that Alexandra Giese, who is a magnificent member of parliament, really put into doing the DSA. The effort she made was extraordinary. And it's a classic European law, very long, very detailed. But the issue is implementation. At this point, and I only care about the reality on the ground, the capacity of European institutions to implement any of these rules against digital giants is practically zero. In the current geopolitical environment, this capacity becomes net negative. And in addition to which, you consider what is the capacity of the platforms themselves to shapeshift and kick the can down the road. That is infinite. So I know that we Europeans, when we go abroad, like to say, it's all happening, trust us, we need to be brave. This is what our commissioner said in DC last week. We need to be brave. But you look at what is happening. The impact has been marginal in terms of the DMA and very, very marginal in terms of the DSA so far. So at this point, and I'll conclude my initial remarks, I'm sorry to be this negative. We are not winning, and we are not going to win in Europe on this. We are not going to move the dial. And worse still, I think that the attention in Europe is really shifted away from these issues. Because what has simultaneously happened is the realization that in the current climate, we have priorities that are beyond taming the platforms. At the moment, Europe is struggling with a growth imperative, which is very serious, and it is struggling with a huge issue of strategic autonomy. We are a colony in a number of dimensions. We are a digital colony of the United States, and it has dawned on everyone that in the current geopolitical environment, we do or die. We decouple or die. And so the defenestration of Zelensky in the Oval Office that Friday night was a Sputnik moment for Europeans, because it was like, oh my God, we are being thrown overboard. The next day was the German election, and Germany pulled out of the hat a €1 trillion investment package in defense and infrastructure, which made all Europeans exhale in some sort of relief. Because if Germany is back, maybe Europe is back. This is what worries us now.
Okay. That is a great place to start. I love the way you framed everything. Let me ask you one quick follow-up question, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just share an observation or even a question for you, Cristina, and just to maximize your time, have you respond as well. So Sputnik moment for sure. What I'm wondering, I'm going to play devil's advocate and perhaps be a little bit hopeful. It does seem as though Trump, the political economy of Trump, is doing something to light a fire under Europe right now. Now, we have not seen the fullness of that, the actions of that, but the way that the Germans are changing their stance on fiscal policy, the way Europeans are saying, yeah, we're going to have to spend more on our own defense. Are we going to see something now? I mean, are we at a tipping point here? Like, is there anything that you could see, any low-hanging fruit that could be pulled in terms of thinking about tech and tech sovereignty?
There is an enormous vibe shift in Europe at the moment. At the moment, there is a huge. It's like you're floating on a raft, and then the giant transatlantic comes to hit you, and this has been that moment. So maybe I'm delusional, but I perceive that there is a new leadership that is emerging, however tentatively, in Germany. And Germany, yesterday, in their coalition agreement, super important point, have explicitly committed to a European digital independence effort. And so that is significant. Will it kind of die of death? I don't know. But the notion that we don't have the kill switch in Europe for our digital infrastructure. The Criminal Court of The Hague, which is one of the key pillars of democracy, has been declared outlawed by President Trump through an executive order. All of their data and files is on a Microsoft server. So how long is it going to be before Microsoft says, sorry, we terminate the contract, and everything needs to scramble to a European cloud? This is the reality of European business today.
Okay, one final thing. Ursula von der Leyen talking about tech taxes. Is it slight, or could we think, hey, this is a first step towards we're maybe going to think about going tougher and working with, some American politicians around this, actually?
So in Europe at the moment, there is a sense that we need to be cautious, and the reaction to the tariffs needs to be cool-headed. And there's been a lot of praise for the limited reaction so far. But the Europeans keep saying, if it doesn't improve, if we don't get a deal, then we're ready to just slam something else. Whether that is going to be digital. I mean, we know in Europe that we have a good surplus with the US, but a huge digital deficit. And so, we could tax that in theory. Whether there is any appetite for inflaming things further remains to be seen. I can't predict.
Okay, awesome stuff. I love this flash round aspect here. Nicola, I'm going to ask you to pop in with an observation too, and a question if you have one, or a comment to Cristina.
I think I essentially agree with everything Cristina said here. There's a big wake-up moment in Europe, awakening. The two things I would point out are, first, the idea that Europe needs to build technology itself. And you can see that through the new discourse on the defense industry, which is a net provider of technological gains over time. We've seen that in the US. So most of the digital technologies we have and previous communications technologies are spillovers from defense investments. And so I look at this with a good eye. And you can see the same dynamic in relation to nuclear atomic technology, where there's also a big shift. It was taboo to talk about that kind of energy in the past, and Europe is now rethinking about its ability to invest and develop and gain these spillovers from innovation. So that's the first observation. The second observation, on which I broadly agree with Cristina, maybe not for the same reasons, is that I don't think that the DMA will achieve much, and I've said that many times, because it was a very poorly conceived and designed regulation. There was no vision behind it. So we have had utilities regulation in the United States and in Europe. These were based on a very clean diagnosis of what was going wrong and what was the outcome that was sought. So there was this theory of, the ladder of investments, service-based competition, and then replaced by facilities-based competition. No such vision has been formulated for the DMA. And the DMA teams today are struggling because they want to enforce all of the DMA without any sense of, explicit priority. And they're praying that one day someone will come with an app store in on a piece of software or hardware and say, I'm ready to launch in Europe. That's what they're just praying for people to come with ideas. We have had conferences in Europe where the policymakers are actively seeking input from technology. When are you coming with technology? It's like, they're on the demand side for something. And I don't think that this is basically a sort of reflection that this was not really well thought out.
Okay, very good. Nolan, do you want to jump in?
Oh, great. No, it's very interesting. So the report that Rana mentioned was really kind of focused on the political economy of tech in the United States. So it was very interesting to hear the European perspective, because I think when we wrote the report, we thought things would be much easier in Europe. There are lots of kind of institutional and cultural reasons why you would expect things to go better in Europe. Mostly that the companies that we were talking about were not European countries. They're companies, they're American companies, and that obviously makes a difference. So I was wondering about getting her views, given how negative she was on Europe, what are her views on the U.S.? Are there any reasons why things might go better in the U.S. in the future than they would in Europe, or if not, why?
You want me to
Yeah,
answer
jump
that?
on and give us a thought.
I'm not optimistic. I'm not optimistic because I think that, there are a number of cases, antitrust cases underway. And that in and of itself has enormous significance. Of course it does. It does. And, the sense of achievement on the steps of the Supreme Court in 2019, and indeed when the Judge Mehta produced almost unexpectedly, or perhaps expectedly, a positive judgment in favor, was huge. And it is enormously significant because, of course, Europe is never going to do anything very structural, and it is the US who has to take the lead. However, the reality to me remains that antitrust is so incredibly ineffectual as a tool to deal with platforms that have already ticked. If we are in a situation where the platform is somewhat there, yesterday there was a judgment in Europe, I'm sorry, but on Google Auto, which was significant because remedies have been imposed in a market which hasn't yet tipped. And maybe there is some hope that remedies there will do something. In the same way as Android in Russia, the remedy succeeded not to kill the competitor. When you're in a market which is already 90% tipped, what do you do? I have endless discussion on remedies, and I applaud the effort to design remedies that are smart. I've seen every conceivable permutation of sell off, break up, do this, do that, assign this, clone that. So we are in 2026, and then we're going to have 6 years of appeals before we get to the Supreme Court, whatever Judge Mehta decides. Where are we going is really to change the situation on the.
It's interesting. Randall, I want to give you a chance to sound off before Cristina has to leave.
Yeah, sure. So that was fun as always. I guess a couple of thoughts. So look, what you described effectively, I think, is that the European antitrust system has been this tax system that you picked up at the end. It's not about a system for changing competition. It's been a system for extracting money from U.S. companies. Been very successful at that. But what if you care about is actually changing competition? It's been a complete failure. And I know what you said about the DMA. I guess what I'm interested in is looking forward. So look, Europe has one great tech company, and that's ASML. Right, the company that gives us all the EUV lithography tools, that all the chips we have that run on. And so if I were Europe, I guess I'd want to figure out how to leverage that opportunity, that bottleneck, and run with it. But I'll spin that out a little bit. If you were giving advice and say growth is our focus, what are the 3 things Europe needs to do?
Great question.
So let me just disagree with your initial statement, because I don't think that Europe did what it did because it was trying to extract money from American companies. Indeed, the fines that were extracted from Google were not, in Google's terms, not particularly significant. It was $5 billion between friends. I mean, it isn't really significant amounts of money. It wasn't the objective. I think that we, at least on the European side, and I think I may agree with Nicolas more than he thinks, I think that the design of a regulation that essentially pretends to be intending to boost European industry by taming someone else is just wrong-headed. Is just wrong-headed to try and think that we are going to create European businesses and European digital companies by hobbling the ones who are here. it's not how you create a business. In this sense, I agree with you. What's the point of trying to constrain? The only thing Europe needs to do is, why don't we have the fragmentation of Europe is the problem. We have a lot of digital businesses. We have a lot of, yes, ASML is a unicorn. But if you think about the pieces of the digital stack, you have lots of cloud, lots of compute, lots of software, lots of stuff, which is scattered across 27 member states and doesn't get pooled. And we don't have anything that is an offer similar to what AWS or Microsoft can do to a company. But that is doable. And there is a sort of a movement that says, why don't we organize our bits and pieces into something? And that is possibly something that will succeed. Growth more, look, we need to be in a quasi-war effort mode. We need to change the factories in Germany to making tanks, but also making more of the clean tech stuff, machinery that Germany excels at and imposed by European rules.
Okay.
Come after us.
Before you have to walk, I want to ask you one tiny question. Actually, it's a big question, but it can be quick. You and I have talked a lot about how Europeans hadn't grappled with power in a long time. They were very focused on rules and technocratic sort of ways of thinking about things, as opposed to really thinking about power in the political economy. I know that you were a fan of some of what was done in the Biden administration because it forced the topic of power. Is Trump, as my colleague getting around, making Europe great again in sense of forcing them to think about power?
Oh, I think the silver lining for Europe may well be that, there is at least to me, an inescapable sense that we need to think about where we stand. Power, Europe remains still confused in many dimensions. We kind of think, Europe thinks antitrust. I still struggle to get them to understand. We have this morning Roger Rolfo talking about sort of tariffs as part of the DOJ sort of purview, right? Gail Slater said last week, and so that the tariffs are part of an America First strategy that she intends to pursue at the DOJ. This is still not the discourse in Europe. It's still a bit, you go trade over there, doing that support. So I think it's not going fast. But the fear and the need to respond that the latest events have instilled in Europeans are real.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. You're now 2 minutes. You rock. All right. Thanks you. That. Now that everyone's awake and excited, all right, we will digest all of that and kind of weave it into the broader conversation we'll now have. And I think, Nolan, I'm going to ask you now to share a few observations on where we've come since 2019, and in particular some of the findings of this report, because you were on the committee, as was I. Basically, have the last 6 years just reaffirmed and strengthened what this report found, or is there something new and surprising that you want to sound off?
Sure, thanks. I guess I should start with my disclosures.
Yes.
So all of my income comes from Princeton University, which is a complex set of cross-cutting conflicts of interest. But I don't know what those conflicts are, so I'm okay. All of my consulting income comes from the much less remunerative field of election law, so none of which has anything to do with what we're talking about today. So let me just talk a little bit about the report that we wrote in 2019. And we were tasked with writing about the political implications of social media, and especially the economic concentration of the platform space. So the report identifies several democratic harms associated with social media, its ability to misinform, its ability to polarize, its ability to harass and challenge. But we also noted that it had become a very important part of the political infrastructure. So much of the discourse around elections and public policy in the United States was taking place on these platforms. So, the central dilemma for us was that here's a vital piece of political infrastructure. It's under the control of a handful of firms. and can be associated with a number of kind of democratic harms. Okay, so that's the place we started from, and so obviously we want to think about solutions. But the first sort of problem, of course, is that these firms are. We argued, and perhaps one could push back on this, that these are uniquely powerful political interests. If you sort of do kind of conventional interest group analysis, that political scientists like I often do, they check off all of the boxes. So they obviously have economic power and resources. They have constitutional protections through First Amendment. Their business models are very complex and not very transparent. They are connective with lots of voters and consumers and users in the kind of gig economy. So they're very well connected. So they're like the National Rifle Association on speed. And then the last point, and this came up in the last session, they're kind of national champions because at least over this period of time, the United States sought to, increase its position of dominance in technology and artificial intelligence. So at the same time in 2019, with these firms were getting beat up in Congress, France dared to put a small tax on Facebook, and the Trump administration went to war with France over that. So no matter what sort of domestic problems they faced, they could always count on the U.S. government to kind of bail them out internationally. So that's the backdrop, and so the task force made several recommendations. Probably the most important of which, and I'll come back to in a second, is the creation of new regulatory authorities. That's the one thing I think, at least in the United States, has not happened over the past 5 years. A very different approach was taken, and that's what I want to spend some effort kind of diagnosing. We didn't discount the role of antitrust. We acknowledged that they could play some role, but many of the political harms we saw weren't directly solvable by traditional antitrust measures, and therefore we didn't make as strong a recommendation with respect to that. And then we have a few other things. We discussed reforming platform liability. We punted on that because we couldn't agree whether changing Section 230 would mean over moderation or under moderation. Just was not a consensus. We talked about more regulation of the role of social media in campaigns and elections, philanthropic disclosures, forcing these companies to acknowledge when they fund academic research in particular. And then we tried to set up some mechanisms for data access for academic and independent research. So the main recommendation was this creation of a digital authority. I won't go through all of the things we said that this digital authority should have, but it was very clear it was going to be an extensive regulatory effort requiring new statutory authorities to be passed to Congress. It would have responsibility for rulemaking in addition to enforcement, so general consumer protection, privacy, transparency, data affordability, data and algorithmic access. So a very large number of things. So it would be rules and enforcement. Again, I said we weren't opposed to antitrust, but we felt like that the regulatory approach was somewhat superior. The puzzle I present with, and I have a few hypotheses, is that it shouldn't surprise anyone that they write a report and it doesn't have a lot of influence. But I think what happened in the Biden administration was exactly the reverse. There was a lot of emphasis on antitrust enforcement, and as far as I can tell, not very much emphasis at all in terms of creating new regulatory authorities. Even gearing up the Federal Trade Commission to do the sorts of things that it could in principle have done without the creation of a new agency. So I have three hypotheses about why this is true. I'm not committed to any of them, but I thought I would throw them out there for discussion. The first possibility is that, even before Chevron deference was eviscerated by the Supreme Court, the existing agency probably really didn't have the statutory authority to do the things that we thought that they should do. But as I've spent most of my career writing on, we're in a kind of a polarized, gridlock political environment, which made, the new statutory route are really difficult. Antitrust enforcement, on the other hand, is basically a unitary executive action, either taken by literally an executive department or what's now a formerly independent agency. And so, it was just easier to go with antitrust enforcement rather than passing new legislation. That's a kind of not a unique observation. I think the second hypothesis is that initiatives such as creating a digital authority were deterred by the political power of the platforms that we talked about in the rest of the report. But I would note that several times over the past 5 years that the platforms or other elements of the tech sector, also the crypto, actually sought regulation. They wanted to be regulated. And in my undergraduate political economy course, I showed the picture of Mark Zuckerberg sitting in front of a congressional committee asking for regulation, and they didn't get it. So I think that leads into the third hypothesis, which is that I think there was a concern of people who care about these issues that regulation first, regulation before eliminating consolidate economic power was a bad idea, because that would just be putting the foxes in charge of the hen house. And when I presented this at the conference 5 years ago, that was the pushback we got, which is that if we created this agency, it would just be captured by the platforms themselves. And so I think that one of the things that thoughts that prevailed was just the idea that you had to do the antitrust first before you could create a regulatory system that could effectively eliminate capture. So I honestly don't know which of these is kind of the most persuasive, but I would just kind of throw out for the idea of discussion that perhaps we should have been willing to accept the weak capture of a new regulatory agency, that we would have a regulatory agency with a lot of influence from the sector, but it wouldn't be, it would still be better than not having the agency. And so I think it was a missed opportunity to try to pursue some of these regulatory reforms in lieu of just a pure antitrust perspective.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to ask you all, both Randy and Nicolas, to talk a little bit about the report's findings and your perception of then versus now. But I want to call out two things, Nolan, that you said that make a lot of sense to me. First of all, I've been thinking about a lot of about complexity in big tech and how it's moving into what's happening with AI. I actually think if you put aside the market chaos of the last couple of weeks, I think that the level of complexity is actually preventing price understanding in AI. I think the fact that you saw, DeepSeek come out of nowhere and the froth just go out of the U.S. markets, part of it is the China threat, but part of it is that nobody really knows whether these things are going to work commercially and in what way. We have a few, 2 or 3 examples. The reason they don't know is that there's a lot of complexity. It reminds me of finance, and then some, because there are even fewer people that can speak to average folks about what's going on. So that's point one. Point two, I wonder, and this is a topic for later on, Musk and literally the visual of oligopoly from Trump's inauguration is just an interesting turning point to me. And I'm seeing I'm in conversations with Democrats thinking about what the ground game is going to be for the next 2 years, but also the next 4. And that feels important. And I think the fragmentation within Trump's own coalition between Musk and MAGA is an interesting moment too. And I'd love to get thoughts on that. But let's step back. Nicolas, I want to give you a chance to just talk first about 2019 versus now, some of the findings in the report. Anything pop for you?
Yeah, so I'll disclose before. So I read the disclosure policy very carefully. Here's my disclosure. Under the policy, I have no conflict of interest. I'm a full-time employee of the European University Institute. The EUI is an international organization of 23 countries. In short, I'm employed by governments. The EUI is essentially funded by the European Commission. The conditions of my employment are aligned with the staff regulations of officials and other civil servants of the European Union. Under my contract, I am prohibited from receiving more than 2,500 euros per year in personal material benefit from outside activities. any crossing of that sitting needs to be approved by the US president. I have asked twice to teach at the College of Europe and receive a honorarium from New York University. That's my disclosure. All right. Then I'll tell you a little bit how I think about this. So I have attended this conference 2 times, and I want to thank Filippo, Luigi, and Guy for inviting me. And I've always found it to be probably the most ambitious event on the circuit. All right. But every time I attended this conference, I was puzzled by one tricky question. Would George Stigler approve? Would he accept the normative affinity that underpins many of the discussions here? And would he even accept the embedded assumptions about the function of regulation that we're talking about? So I had a long flight, which allowed me the opportunity to reread the 1971 classic paper entitled The Theory of Economic Regulation. And I reread it with a single question in mind. How would Stigler look at today's regulation of big tech? Okay. So let me just start by a reminder of what is in this paper. The main contention is that regulation is never adopted for the benefits of the public. It is acquired. Industries, not individual companies, acquire regulation from the states, and politicians supply it in exchange for votes, resources, and extra political payments. The second point is that industries or occupations covering a wide public are the typical acquirers of regulation. And amongst them, small firms and outliers are the net beneficiaries of the gains from regulation. Okay? The political process is not such that every wealthy company or industry is going to get what it wants. It's more complicated. All right. The last important point in the Stigler paper is that the typical favor that an industry will ask from the state, and is very clear on that, is to saddle rival industries with limits on entry and expansion growth. Okay? So what happens when we apply this logic to digital platforms? That's the question. So the dominant narrative today that digital platforms, Google, Amazon, Meta, Apple, what have you, have acquired immense political power, and their scale and wealth and lobbying budgets are seen as tools of capture of the state, right? But here's the puzzle. If big tech has captured regulation, why is so much regulation being thrust upon them, as Stigler would say? Okay, so we are seeing a lot of costly rules, the DMA, the DSA, the antitrust cases, data laws, data localization laws, speech regulation, you name it. And these rules, they are not symbolic. They impose costs on these businesses. So the outcome contradicts one basic finding from Stigler, which is that industries almost exceptionally never acquire regulation against themselves. Right? Why would you do that? So the question I think that Stigler would ask is to say, well, if these burdens were not acquired by digital platforms, who acquired that regulation? Right? And I think the conventional hypothesis here that we have to look at our hypothesis of inter-industry competitors. So Stigler pushes a lot these points. The competitors located in other industries are the ones that acquire regulation. Okay, so the classic example he uses is that incumbent industries like railroads acquired regulation against a new competitor, motor trucking. So who is the railroads here? Right? And you can look at the list and do the search on sites like Open Secrets. You're going to find these industries there in these numbers. The news media threatened by platform dominance in advertising. Telecom and cable providers that want to charge or get compensation for distribution of content. Copyright holders that are trying to, seek compensation also for content creation. So all these industries have motives to limit the entry and the growth of platform entries into their space. And it makes a lot of sense. Now, Stigler would also point out to something that he called the defensive power, right? So I want to give credit to that thesis here, which is that the industry that is being burdened may have enough political power to moderate the weight on the restrictions on entry and growth. And if you look at this, you can ask yourself, like the DMA, for instance, that I know well, what was taken out of the DMA, right? That could be interesting to study. So we know that mandatory social media interoperability was in the proposal, removed. Merger bans, removed. Bans on targeted advertising, removed, sent to the DSA with lots of conditions and segmentation. So that may be what the political power of big tech has acquired. Okay, I just want to close with one, I think, a minus line in the initial Stigler paper from 71. It's at the end, and I'm going to quote him. Quote, if a political party has in effect a monopoly control over the governmental machine, one might expect that it could collect most of the benefits of regulation for itself. So if no industry can reliably acquire regulation, the state itself may become the monopolist. Okay, and in that world, regulation becomes a tool for rent extraction. Maybe this is what we saw at the inauguration party. So what we, I think, are going to see today is a system, a new phase of capture, which is not necessarily regulatory capture, but industry capture, in which discretionary ad hoc regulation will arise decoupled from any coherent economic logic and shaped by short-term political traits. So what you're going to see is that things like the TikTok asset sale or the scrutiny of the upcoming Google-Wiz merger are things that are going to be bartered against political scalps through a channel of communication that may not even directly involve the FTC or the DOJ, right? This, I think, is what we're headed up to. And so just let me end with this. The common story, big tech controls the rules, doesn't hold up. I think what we have seen recently is that big tech is more motor trucking than railroads. And what we're going to see in the future is that the government might be the railroads itself.
Wow, that is provocative. And I have about 1,000 follow-up questions that I would ask. I'll just make one observation. As you were speaking, I was thinking, okay, so what's the difference between tech regulation under Trump and under Xi Jinping now? What's, how is, and I'm also thinking about how a longtime source of mine and someone that worked in democratic politics and in finance once told me that he thought the future of the U.S. v. China would be decided by who could best control their elites. But you're talking about a state that is the rent extractor itself, which is something different. Anyway, fascinating topic. We'll go deeper if we have time. But Randy, I want to turn the floor over to you now, and feel free to sound off on anything that you've heard that's of interest, but also give us your sense of then, now, and what's really popping for you.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me here. I don't think I have any relevant conflicts of interest. Like my colleagues over here, I'm paid by my academic employer, and I have hopes that will continue for some time. We will see. 2019 seems like a long time ago. Obviously, so much has happened since then. And when you sit down and look at the report is, situated in a world of like Google and Facebook and Twitter, even Instagram. I don't know what you guys were thinking. I don't mean that as a shot. What were you thinking? Doesn't get a lot of play in the report, which seems shocking. But that's without getting to what's happened since then. That's not on you, obviously. So TikTok just got mentioned. Obviously, the rise of TikTok, the movement from U.S. national champions to Chinese national champions and world powers and all the complexities that creates. Then the fragmentation, the rise of things like Blue Sky. We learned earlier today that 4 more law firms have signed deals. How did we learn that? because the president posted on Truth Social, right? That's how we learn that. And we go through that. I'd never been on Truth Social until just a few minutes ago. I see that you don't retweet on Truth Social, you retruth. Okay, good to know. So I do think that landscape has changed, and that's without getting to the fact that, of course, in just like a fit of, oh, what can I do? Elon buys Twitter. And now, as you see today's New York Times, right, how X is capitalizing on Musk's insider status, this fusion, right? And I'm going to go where you are. This fusion of the social media, of the private interests, and then the public sphere. I think we're seeing that in an incredibly raw way in this moment. And that's not the thing that actually scares me the most, but that's a longer discussion. So I do think that landscape has changed in powerful ways. No reason you would have expected that, but I think it's actually quite dramatic. And if what you're focused on a little bit, and certainly the Trump administration is very focused on this, is the question as to whether or not, conservative voices are getting thwarted, the change in the ownership of Twitter obviously really matters. Okay, so that's, I think, my first point. Second point. I didn't see Andrew Ferguson's talk last night. I saw a few things on it on Twitter as I think of it last night. But I did watch, they had a big tech censorship forum at DOJ last Thursday. And Gail Slater was there, and Andrew Ferguson was there, and Brendan Carr was there. Rogge was there as well. They had a number of discussions. And what is so clear about that is that the administration wants to use whatever existing tools, not new tools are hard, whatever existing tools they have to try to address this perceived problem of big tech censorship. I will say I don't love the term big tech. I think these firms are meaningfully different, but for simplicity of time, I'm just going to call them big tech. And what that means is, and now I look at what you just said, they're going to use the tools that are in place. And those tools, I don't know if they were bought and paid for, I don't know, but man, they were bought and paid for a long time ago. So this is the 1890 Sherman Act, the 1914 Federal Trade Commission Act, the amendments to the FTC Act in 1938, the Wheeler Act, which creates the Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices and Acts. On the communications side, it's the 1934 Communications Act, and obviously the 1996 Telecommunications Act. Those are the tools they're going to try to run with. And they're going to take an expansive approach to those. I actually think that will be easier to do on the FTC side. There's a certain irony that on the FCC side, the evolution of agency doctrine in the Supreme Court with the major questions doctrine and Loper-Bright, which you referenced, means that the agencies, as it were, at least nominally, have less room to operate. But there is no doubt that the current FCC is going to try to run at understanding 230 and limiting 230 in ways that will test the Supreme Court doctrine that's been created in the last few years. I do think, and this is where you were, look, I think we're in this era, you called it sort of discretionary regulation. I bought a book the other day. I felt guilty buying it. I bought The Art of the Deal. Yeah, and I wish there was some other way to do it. I teach copyright, so I do not steal content, but I was tempted. Okay. But I do think we're now in this era of regulation by threat and the art of the deal. That scares the hell out of me. I say that as someone at a university, obviously, and watching this at universities, watching the law firms. I'm at a law school. And then my question is, what deals will get cut and why? And then I go, well, what is it that big tech wants? Big tech in the United States maybe wants Trump to deal with Europe. Maybe Europe's the threat. Cristina says maybe not. That's not how they behave, right? So can Washington and big Trump, can Trump control Europe? And what would big tech be willing to give to get that? That's the other piece of that you want to think about, right? What are they going to give to get that? They'd like to see the Facebook antitrust case go away. What are they willing to give to get that? And it's sort of the invisible deals, the less visible deals. That's what I think should really concern us.
Wow, a lot there. Okay, start getting questions ready. I'm going to ask just one more thing, and then I think we'll open it up because there's so many places that we can go, and I want to see where the energy in the audience is. You know, one of the things that it has just been very troubling for me, and the penny dropped perhaps a little later than it should because I'm in traditional media, but this last election cycle was incredible in where people got their information. I mean, it really was kind of a pivot point because you saw the 3-hour Trump Joe Rogan podcast really being the only thing that you needed to watch. They just didn't pay attention to anything else and didn't need to. And then on the flip side, you saw Kamala Harris doing I'm going to now forget the name because I haven't had coffee, but another
I know who you're
you know what I'm talking about? Yeah.
What's their name?
Call your daddy. Thank you. Everybody else is hipper than me. Okay, this is pathetic. I mean, I'm in media. I had never heard of Call Your Daddy. 23 million views, more than all the cable prime time together. It is, as I've been doing some on-the-ground reporting since and digging into just stories like how Trump's tariff chaos is playing out. Yes, people are concerned about their 401ks, but there's also a lot of people that are, in Indiana, where I grew up, in Pennsylvania, in places where, they are not reading the FT, needless to say, and listening to totally different information sources. It seems very, very difficult in this environment to even make an argument, let alone affect change. And I'm just curious. Take that where you will. What would you say about this? Where are we in terms of being able to control the power of these giants? I mean, Nicola, maybe you want to start because you have a somewhat different theory about how this is playing out.
Well, I would distinguish the platform from individuals controlling the platform. I mean, there is massive efficiency in having these distribution systems for content and opinion. And there are inefficiencies in the ownership of these platforms. I mean, in Europe, we have a long tradition of trying to, break up ownership and have these unconcentrated. Italy is a good example with Berlusconi that was trying to control ownership over every TV channel he could, and on newspaper. And there's very strong sentiment in the Italian population, this country I live in now, that it's a very important issue in the population. So people do not feed information regardless of the platform. They pay attention to this. They pay attention to ownership of the platform, and of course, you always have to work on this. But you can educate people to think carefully about these questions of media ownership, right? So we have a center at the UI that works on this media ownership, and so I think. You have to disentangle the discussion on, whether large platforms are something you want or not, because at the end of the day, you're not going to get rid of the convenience provided by network effects, on the supply or the demand side. But you want to think about who owns that. I mean, as someone yesterday mentioned this, I find it outrageous that you're not following Elon Musk on Twitter and still you get these tweets in your face every time you open your app, right? And I just find this completely outrageous. This is not the Twitter I signed up for. So we need to work on these fixes, and rather than incriminate the large scale of these distribution platforms.
Nolan, anything you want to?
Yeah, so this is related to the point Randy made about the number of outlets sort of changing since 2019. We didn't talk about Instagram. It wasn't very political at the time. Yeah. We were coming up the 2016 election, and
by the way, just
about Facebook.
One point on that I want to insert. The tech companies themselves would use that very point as an argument to say, see, new entries can come up and disrupt, and that's one of the arguments that they make.
Yeah.
But we don't have too much power.
Yeah.
Instagram can come.
But to sort of tie it to your point, that we've even Randy's extended list is short of what has changed since 2019, because now you have the podcasts
for sure,
and the Substacks, and just a wide variety of things. Now, maybe not getting to people in Indiana or Texas where I grew up, but the number of sources in the 2024 election seemed much higher than before.
Profoundly fragmented.
Profoundly fragmented. Yeah. But one of the things I think about this is just an observation about the podcasts and the Substacks, is they really are individuals behind them, and they have individual reputations. So one of the things we've seen in the last few weeks is the guy from Barstool of Sports ranting about tariffs. We've seen
That's right.
the Joe Rogan ranting about tariffs. And so you do have an opportunity, because there's more people and they're sort of tied to their individual reputations, that maybe that will mix up the information environment much more than we've seen before. One other just sort of follow-up I want to make to some of the things that were mentioned before. The report actually does focus on two types of capture: the capture of the regulator by the firms, but also the capture of the firms by the regulator. And so just an interesting side note is that we recommended very strongly that it be an independent agency, more or less modeled after something like the CFPB, in order to prevent both of those forms of capture. But of course, as we know now, that's not
I'm not even going to spend that much time on agencies because it sort of seems beside the point. Okay, Randy.
Your examples are just super fascinating, right? And it goes exactly to what was just said here. Look, these are entrants, right? And able to do this at scale. And that's remarkable. The political salience of them you see. And then I want to talk about how rapid the movement can be in this space. So who displaced Joe Rogan as the #1 podcast? Kylie Kelsey, right? And she just comes out of nowhere, sort of out of the growing Kelsey empire, and Travis and Taylor and all that. And
I love that you're talking about this. We're at University of Chicago. We're talking.
we can
Travis.
do that too. So fun doesn't necessarily have to die. But that's fantastic, because it really means that new voices are possible. Okay.
All right, I'm going to open it up, and then not. You're all about power, so I'm coming to you.
First, I have a piece of news. I hear that the Social Security Administration is going to stop publishing any communication except on X. So, apropos Randy's,
Yes, absolutely.
the use of X for communication by a Social Security Administration serving, senior people, et cetera. Anyway, but what I wanted to go to is actually the invocation of Stigler. So, in the 50 years to Stigler, I was asked by the Stigler Center to comment on Stigler, and I wrote a piece called George Stigler and the Challenge of Democracy. And in it, so I did read the piece, which I actually haven't read before. And I want to bring up, yes, he talked about, industries acquiring regulation. And that's the way people mostly think about it. But he had a much more nuanced view of politics, which is a topic of this panel. And what he said specifically is that politics is an imponderable, a constantly and unpredictably shifting mixing of forces of the most diverse nature, or comprehending acts of great moral virtue, like the emancipation of slaves, and the most vulgar venality, congressman feathering his own nest. Political processes, in other words, complex and messy. Outcomes may benefit society or, in fact, may reflect corruption and abuse of power. So now if you go to the way, it actually plays out, first of all, they don't acquire the regulation. Oftentimes they lobby against regulation. And that's certainly true for this space that we're talking about here, because we're starting with an industry that's just comes out of the world unregulated, unlike, say, banking, which is always kind of political. But just to say, the lobbying is sort of, Wolves of K Street, all of that is shaping all the rules. But the people who are heard, as we know from studies, are the, those with power and those with connections.
I'm gonna ask
So
you just.
my question is, my observation to you is, the power structure here is such that, we won't get the regulator you wanted to. What might we get?
Okay, who wants to take that? Nicolas?
So the 71 paper says explicitly, these are the words he's using, that the political process is a noisy filter. He uses the term noisy, so it's not a. Stigler didn't say I can predict where the regulation is going to go, right? And one of the things that he said that not every large industry will get what it wants. That's literally his words, right? So, the lobbying spending number that people like to bring up is not a good predictor of where and to which industry this is going to benefit, right? So that assumption, I think Stigler would be extremely uncomfortable with that idea. Like, you look at lobbying numbers, or you look at lobbying intensity, so the ratio of lobbying to revenue or profits, and you derive a prediction from this, right? There's no inference you can derive from this. And actually all the empirical work he does in the paper, so the trucking industry versus the railroads industry, he confirmed this. Similarly, he has a lot of paragraphs on something that you call occupational licensing in the US, if I understand well. And he says, this is like extremely messy, right? It's hard to read the numbers, the correlations go in very direction, it's not statistically significant. So it's very careful. I think one thing that he said, and that goes back to a point that you both made, is that he said one of the imperfections of the political system is that there's no way to aggregate the preferences of the public opinion on a daily basis. This is an intermittent process, right? And he or she who controls the large platform at a given point in time, that is, the sort of overtone window in which he can shape opinion, right, will have a sort of path-dependent effect on where democracy is going. That's what you were talking about, Randy, right? So you bring the new entrant comes, gets this large megaphone in no time. This gets acquired by someone who is not a friend of democracy. You just show 2 or 3 factory strikes in Germany, migration scandals and that sort of stuff. And there you go, you won the election by a landslide. I think the political system has not yet developed. Martin Gurry was talking about this yesterday. We work with very static tools, right? And so we have this aggregation of political preferences that come every 4 years in America, maybe every 5 years in France, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's more probably frequent, but still it's very static.
Let me ask you a quick, what do you think about things like quadratic voting? And, are there things at the margins that could be taking us in a more nuanced direction here?
I just have to say, if I answer this, I'll have to revise my disclosure.
Oh. That's so funny. Okay, well, maybe we'll move on. I think there was a question over here.
That's funny.
So as I think the only other, yes, like yes, all right, I get your thought.
No, it's for the recording. Okay.
Do you mind as the only other member of the panel who's here today? Can I make a quick couple of quick comments? Okay.
Yay.
All right. Yeah. So I was on the panel with the two of them and other excellent colleagues 6 years ago. I want to make 2 comments. One in response to Randy, your point about these other platforms.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely a big difference. I've gotten a million questions. I got a million questions going into the election. What's different from the social media perspective or from the digital media perspective going into the 2024 election from 2020? It's obviously a really big difference. I want to put out a theoretically argumentative point here about that what we have seen is a fairly consistent rule that it is pretty hard to develop a new platform that competes with the incumbent platform without offering new affordances. And I think that's the key here. And there's 2 ways to think about those affordances. One way to think about those affordances is you make you kind of keep the platform similar, but you aim it at a niche audience, right? So Truth Social or Blue Sky or something like that, they look like things we've seen. But the other things that you've mentioned, like the rise of Instagram and TikTok and podcasts, right? These are kind of new affordances. And that's where the opportunity here is. And I think for those of you who think about concentration in this industry, I think you always have to think about the trade-off between the network effects which makes a platform that has more people on it more valuable for the users. And so that's where I think we get into this question of why can these new platforms come about? Well, because they offer something new to the user and they don't have to compete with an incumbent with network effects. Now, there are a lot of people on the tech side of things that are thinking exactly about the kind of stuff you were talking about here. Go to a Project Liberty blockchain conference, you'll be like a million different things about people owning the algorithm, and middleware came up yesterday. And, so there's those sort of like tinkering around at the margins type things about, but keeping the affordances somewhat similar. I think that would fit into this sort of niche platform. I want to have a platform which doesn't show me this kind of content or allows me to this kind of thing. The second one I want to make, which goes directly to the report and the big part of the report that Nolan's talked about a little bit already, is that we don't really know what happened on these platforms during the election. Because the other part of the report that we were advocating for then was a regulatory approach to data accessibility for researchers. Now, we've heard earlier at this conference about DSA. We heard earlier in this panel about DSA and how slowly that's moving along. But the reality of the situation is we just went through another election. And, I think we really want to be thinking about, apropos the previous panel, do we want our understanding of the intersection between these large digital platforms, even when there's more of them, and our politics to be guided by opinion pieces and to be guided by anecdotes and to be guided by, what people observe in their own personal life? Or do we want it guided, our understanding, and be able to deliver to policymakers by rigorous scientific research? And there are steps that can be taken. There was this should be a bipartisan issue, which is not something we say very often about anything, but there was a bipartisan bill introduced in Congress, in the last Congress, the PATA Act, Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, that would have, among other things, have indemnified researchers who were scraping data for scientific research purposes, provided this, privacy considerations were respected. And then there's also the question of just regulating access to data and making it accountable. So I think that's an important part of the report that was in there 6 years ago that is still just as relevant today, in a sense, even more relevant as the number of platforms that we want to understand has increased. So
Great points. I'm glad you brought this up. Anybody want to sound off? No? Okay. Okay. Yep. Go ahead.
No, I was interested in the comment you made about Joe Rogan and news influencer, because that was probably unexpected in 6 years ago, that digital platform became relevant also for opinion journalism and not only for gathering news information. My experience interacting with Spotify or Substack is that these are curated content. Joe Rogan is paid by Spotify. It's the number one because it is paid by Spotify. They're not true random things that happen together. So I was wondering what you expect in the near future about this, because to me, as a journalist, the platform are destroying the very last part remaining to newspaper, which is like opinion pieces. And I mean, Paul Krugman quit the New York Times to start its own Substack. So is this a new phase where, the public space has evolved in a different way? They gained influence in a way that is unpredictable. It was not expected in this way.
I'll say one thing as a journalist who's kind of in the middle of this, and then I'll turn it over to anybody else who wants to comment. Part of people going to Substack is about profit sharing in the media industry itself, which is not great. You have tools now that can tell you exactly, for better or worse, which journalists and which stories are generating profits, basically, eyeballs. And I think that these tools are making it clear that the superstar model is hardening. There's a small handful of journalists that are bigger brands often, or as big brands as the publications that they work for, and can go and make multiple times their income on these new platforms and do it successfully. And it's interesting to me. We could have a whole nother session on this, but conflicts of interest in media and some of the rules that media brands hold for individual journalists versus what they hold for themselves as entities is interesting. And there's a gap there, which is what people like Paul Krugman are going into, because he doesn't have to work for the New York Times. He can, and there's a bunch of other people like that.
On this point, it's striking to me how many journalists use information they acquired during their day job and save it for their book. Here, that could be reported in a timely way.
So I didn't understand on the question, if I could, whether destroying and competing were different words, right? So you said destroying, right?
No, I mean, I quit the traditional newspaper and I started my own Substack. No, no. I am just worried because as a Substack user, and I make my part of my living with it, and I make more money than in a traditional newspaper. So I recommend Rana
All right.
to do that.
Matt,
But
I
no, the question was simply, platform has a real power in shaping this content. That's it.
Okay. I think, yeah, we got that. Matt, I want to give you a shot and then we'll go back to Luigi.
I just want to make the point that I don't think there's really much change from 2020 to 2024. I mean, Joe Rogan interviewed Bernie Sanders. I mean, we had TikTok. I started my Substack in 2019. Google was dominant. Instagram was dominant. It's still dominant. Like, I think it's really weird to say everything has changed. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills when I hear that.
I don't think that's what we're saying, though. I think, but maybe
That's what
maybe-
Randy said.
No. One, you were ahead of the
That's-
curve. You were ahead of the curve on Substack. Good for you. That's what a good, smart entrant should do.
No. Google had 90% market share
For
in
sure.
2020. They had 90% market share today.
In
Facebook-
in 2009, they had a 90% market share.
Right.
Okay.
So, but we're talking about 2019 to 2020.
Yeah.
I think this is very cynical because I think
Being cynical.
I think there's a cynicism on the panel of trying to say that look at all of this technological change. Everyone knows that Apple's iPhone has been the same every year since it's a joke now, right? This is a popular joke. And here I'm listening to a panel of people saying, look at all these changes. I think it's ridiculous. And I just wanted to make that point.
No, I think that's actually fair. I think that's fair. Okay. Okay, just come back to that. Luigi, this is your show, so
I just wanted to relate a question that was raised in my panel with team, and I wanted to bring it to you because I don't think you were around. Which I don't have I have a partial answer, but I open to question because I think is really really important. So, if you are Joe Rogan and you have access to 10 million, whatever is the million, I don't know what. You might have an impact on the election. And it's to say, allegedly, I don't know whether that's true, allegedly Kamala Harris tried to get on Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan made it difficult for her to be. And, we like to play, but I believe that this might be much more influential than the Russia interference in 2016. Okay? Because I think that the Russia interference was a joke, and it was helpful for the Democrats to say, we did not lose the election. But I think that it's possible. So now, and I understand it's part of Spotify, etc. But at the end of the day, we have some people that have a dramatic influence in the election. And in the case of Elon Musk, he also owns X. But forget for a second he owns X. As I said this morning, he have 200 million followers, and he interferes in the election in Germany and in the UK, not in the election, but in the normal politics in the UK, in a way that is massive. And should, with all this power, come some responsibility or not?
well, yeah, I was arguing for that in my book in 2019 too, but nobody bought it. So
That's not the question. The question is, with all that power, does it come with regulation? Right? That's the question, right? I mean, it's not responsibility. That would be fantastic. But the question...
So there's some form of,
Nicolas.
So we had, very established rules on the separation of ownership between content and infrastructure. And here we may have to think of, new rules separating influencers from ownership. So these conflicts of interest have existed and for a long time. And maybe we need the sort of intellectual direction that you're pointing out. Luigi seems to intuit that we need to think about, is it good to be a very large influencer, but also own the platform so you can preference your content all the time and gain increasing influence. So that, I think, is sort of problems we have today. I also would disagree with the idea that nothing has changed. I mean, every person that studies history know that small events matter. And so, much of the push for regulating big tech came from things like Cambridge Analytica, the Snowden scandal, and, other, forms of social events that were pretty small, but that propagated in the system. And now we are faced with another, I would say, constellation of small events, like, the judge ordering Elon Musk to buy Twitter. He wanted to back off, and then the judge said, no, you have to buy. That's the sort of migration spillovers from the crisis in Syria, right? And a few other things here and there. And that creates another. So I don't think, saying, okay, the market share of Google hasn't changed, I think obfuscates attention to the small events of history that create enormous past dependency in a political system.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Only raise your hand if it's a really good one.
Wow, the heck you stand.
Okay, right there.
You made it very difficult. I don't know if it's a very good one, but thank you for the opportunity. I want to go back to a point that was made earlier. Can't remember who made the point, but it was a question about what would big tech give to Trump to deal with Europe. I wonder if we can stay with that question for a little bit. This is a question for all of the panelists. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
And I framed it as Europe, and I instantly said, oh, I should have said tariffs as well, right? So there are any number of things you could imagine they want. Please,
Yeah, go ahead.
So I listened to something that is probably legal in certain circles here. This All In podcast. All In. It's like for tech billionaires, and when they talk about technology, they talk about it, I find, in a very educated way. So it's very interesting, but they're also very Trumpist in a way, and I sort of struggle with that. But the other day on the podcast, there was all this talking about how the government's trying to ask digital companies to build infrastructure for the government for free. And they were talking about this like, they are going to do it for free, right? And I think this is the kind of concessions you could see that, Google or Oracle or Salesforce is going to build like a new stack for whatever for free in exchange for another benefit that could be pressuring the EU, with the DMA fines or, lifting some. Yeah, I think these are the trades we're going to see.
100%. I mean, I'll go a little off piste and say, how many people are down with and have read about the whole dark enlightenment stuff? Okay. So, they want a world without government. And I think that
You want to know the press laws. Also, they want a government, the fascist.
they want an old, I wouldn't, okay.
They say that there should be a CEO
Right.
power.
Right. A monarch. Okay, so is that a government? Okay, but yes, a monarch.
Is a government.
Okay.
Outside of the walls.
Okay, so yeah, I think that's one of the reasons you see, meddling in Germany. I think that there's a really kind of quite strategic attempt to undermine democracy in Europe. I know that the Europeans are talking to certain democratic legislators about how to, overcome this, but I think it's a real danger. I don't have much more to say about it than that. Nolan, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat related. You mentioned we might talk about this strange coalition, the Republican Party, between MAGA and Big Tech. And, it's a very odd coalition that I can't really think of any historical examples of. I mean, they really have diametrically opposed preferences on lots of issues. And some of those are like how to deal with international trade, how to deal with Europe, whether we should have, any connections at all. So I think anything by way of prediction is really going to depend on, how long that coalition lasts. Sometimes it'll look like Tech has the upper hand. Sometimes it'll look like MAGA has the upper hand. I'm actually betting on MAGA.
I'm betting on MAGA too.
And we'll see then what Tech does. There's a question about whether or not what we saw at the inauguration was the consolidation of authoritarian power around tech, or whether it was just partisan polarization around this set of policy issues. I think it's probably polarization around these issues, and if tech finds that Republicans are not reliable partners anymore, they'll go back to the party that they spent the last 20 years with. I mean, it's not a great thing for democracy, but I think the idea that there's been a cemented coalition in the Republican Party that's going to look like this for the long haul is it's a little premature.
Okay, we're going to end this panel with a poll of the audience. MAGA v. Musk. Who thinks MAGA will win? Raise your hand. Interesting. Okay. Musk. Interesting. All right. A small but influential group.
I've always we need an Ehrlich Simon style bet on this.
Okay. All right.
Everybody wants to come up with that one.
I'm going to be ruthless about timing. Thank you guys. Awesome panel. Thanks for the discussion.